In the bustling boroughs of 1950s Brooklyn, a 13-year-old boy named Henry Hill was captivated by the power and prestige of the men who ruled his neighborhood. While most kids were at school, Henry was shining Cadillacs and running errands for suited gangsters. He wasn't born into that life, but he desperately wanted to be a part of it. To him, the mafia wasn't just crime, it was status, it was respect, and most of all, it was freedom. Henry's father worked an honest job and had no ties to the criminal world, yet that didn't stop Henry from slipping away daily to serve the neighborhood wise guys and soak up their energy. His duties were simple at first, fetching newspapers, carrying groceries, parking cars, but for Henry, even menial tasks held promise. Every step brought him closer to the life he idolized. Despite his youth, he began earning more money than his father. Even local business owners treated him with reverence, fearing the men he served more than respecting the laws of the land. Skipping school became routine, and soon Henry's education came entirely from the streets. His lessons were about loyalty, leverage, and how fear can be more valuable than friendship. His greatest inspiration came from Paul Vario, the local mafia captain who controlled the eastern part of New York. Paul was feared, respected, and moved like royalty, everything Henry aspired to be. Vario operated under the powerful Lucchese crime family, one of the infamous 5 families that dominated organized crime in the city. The Lucchese family had soldiers, captains, and underbosses in a hierarchy that ran deeper than most governments. To rise in the mafia, you needed Italian blood, a reputation for violence, and unshakable loyalty. Henry, though only part Italian, had enough charm and guts to still earn a place in their world. It wasn't long before he graduated from errands to more intimidating assignments. Whether smashing windows or collecting debts, Henry proved himself as someone who got the job done. By his mid-teens, he had become a trusted associate, respected by men who'd once looked down on him. Power started to trickle into his life like a drug, one he couldn't resist. This new life brought him into contact with Jimmy Burke, a towering figure known on the streets as Jimmy the Gent. Despite lacking full Italian heritage, Jimmy commanded enormous respect and ran his crew with iron precision. Jimmy didn't have an official mafia rank because of his Irish bloodline, but no one dared question his authority. He made up for it with unmatched ruthlessness and a reputation for always tipping generously. His nickname, the Gent, came from the fact that he tipped everyone from valets to waiters without hesitation. But behind the charm was a man responsible for countless violent acts and meticulous robberies. Jimmy had started in crime at 16, and by the time he met Henry, he was a seasoned mastermind. Truck hijackings were his specialty. Booze, cigarettes, seafood, you name it, he could fence it within hours. He wasn't just good at robbery, he had the NYPD in his pocket, and even truck drivers often cooperated with him in exchange for a cut. With street loyalty and police silence, Jimmy became unstoppable. Seeing potential in Henry, Jimmy took him under his wing and introduced him to Tommy DeSimone. Tommy was Henry's age, brash and explosive, and the three quickly formed a tightly knit brotherhood. Tommy had a hair-trigger temper and would later earn the nickname Two-Gun Tommy. While Jimmy was the brains and Henry the loyal student, Tommy was pure chaos wrapped in a suit. Their playground was the chaotic ecosystem surrounding JFK Airport. It wasn't just an airport, it was a treasure trove for criminals with the right connections. Trucks left JFK daily loaded with goods, electronics, fashion, foreign currency, and the mafia had eyes on everyone. Many truckers were family, friends, or paid informants who tipped off the crew when a juicy load left the tarmac. With Paul Vario's men working inside the airport in security, customs, and freight, the mafia had complete visibility. Every shipment was a potential payday, and no one dared cross them. If a truck driver ever declined to cooperate, he wouldn't live to regret it. Resistance was rare, and when it happened, it ended fast, usually with a body dumped somewhere discreet. By the late 1960s, Henry, Jimmy, and Tommy were already legends within their circle. Their operations were smooth, efficient, and soaked in fear. No unnecessary violence, but never afraid to draw blood. While robbing trucks had become routine, Jimmy had bigger visions. He wanted to crack open an actual airport vault. That opportunity came in 1967 through an inside man named Robert. Robert worked for Air France and approached Jimmy and Henry with a tip. A shipment of untraceable US dollars was coming to their warehouse. These were tourists' exchange dollars, not government money, making the cash virtually impossible to track. The cash would arrive at JFK late at night and sit in a restricted storage room until armored trucks picked it up the next morning. The room had only one key, and the night guard always kept it on him. The idea was risky, but the reward was enormous, an estimated $500,000 in cash, equivalent to $4 million today. Jimmy, as usual, wanted the cleanest possible job. Instead of brute force, they devised a plan to seduce the guard and borrow the key without his knowledge. Using a woman as bait, Robert lured the guard to a hotel where they were able to lift the key while he was distracted. A duplicate was made, and the key was returned before the guard noticed anything missing. Now they had access to a room filled with cash, and the perfect time to strike. On April 7, 1967, Henry and Tommy entered the Air France warehouse pretending to search for lost luggage. It was half an hour before midnight during the guard's scheduled break. Using the copied key, they entered the vault-like room without resistance. Inside, they found the fortune Robert had promised, stacked and bagged, just waiting to be taken. They loaded it into a duffel bag and walked out without a single soul stopping them. No guns, no screams, just in-and-out precision that stunned even Jimmy. After the job, they handed 20% of the take to Paul Vario, who had authorized the job. That was the cost of doing mafia business. Tribute to the man above you, no questions asked. Years passed, and each man climbed deeper into the criminal world. Henry got married, started dealing cocaine on the side, and began drifting toward the most dangerous part of mafia life, drugs. Paul Vario strictly forbade drug trafficking because it attracted federal heat, but Henry did it anyway, thinking he could keep it secret, a decision that would later haunt him. Meanwhile, Jimmy was growing more powerful, orchestrating larger hits and expanding his network. Tommy, on the other hand, only got more dangerous with time. In one infamous incident, Tommy shot a man in the leg over a minor insult and then killed him for cursing afterward. The man's only mistake, reminding Tommy that he once shined shoes for mafia men as a kid. That man, William Bentvena, was a made member of the Gambino family. Killing a made man without permission was a death sentence in mafia law. Still, Tommy didn't care. 2 weeks after the insult, he ambushed William with Henry and Jimmy's help, beat him unconscious and stuffed him into a car trunk. On their way to dispose of the body, they heard thumping from the trunk. William was still alive. Tommy didn't flinch. He grabbed a knife and finished the job himself. They buried the body in a remote field, hoping the problem was solved. But such reckless bloodshed would have consequences. Years later, it would come back to haunt them. Despite the chaos, Jimmy's focus never wavered. He had his sights on something much bigger, a hit that would make history. And in 1978, that chance arrived at JFK again. But this time it wasn't France, it was Germany. It all started with a warehouse worker named Peter, a quiet man with sharp instincts and an eye for patterns. For over 2 years, he studied every inch of the Lufthansa cargo building at JFK Airport. He wasn't a gangster or a crook, just a curious employee wondering how vulnerable the system really was. Day by day, he noticed the rhythm of incoming goods, outgoing shipments, and the flow of people in and out. Peter quickly realized that the Lufthansa terminal wasn't just a logistical hub, it was a gold mine waiting to be robbed. Jewelry, foreign currency, and gold bullion passed through the building like clockwork. European banks used Lufthansa flights to ship millions in cash and valuables to New York. These shipments would sit in the warehouse vault temporarily before armored trucks came to collect them. But the process was sluggish, especially in December when holiday volume was high. Sometimes money would sit unprotected for hours or even days. Peter sketched diagrams, tracked delivery schedules, and quietly logged which workers were on duty during different shifts. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. He was building a heist blueprint without even realizing it. Eventually, he brought in a co-worker named Louis Werner, who was more desperate than daring. Louis was drowning in gambling debt and owed money to some very dangerous people. When Peter finally shared his plan, Louis saw it not as a fantasy, but as his only shot at survival. The warehouse wasn't a fortress, it was a ticking vault just waiting for someone to break in. Together, they refined the plan with every passing week. Peter provided the insight and Louis understood the stakes. But their alliance was fragile, especially since Louis had a secret agenda. Behind Peter's back, he took the detailed plan and ran straight to the people he feared most. Louis owed money to the mafia and figured he could erase his debts by giving them the golden ticket. So he reached out through his gambling contacts and offered them the heist on a silver platter. That offer made its way to Jimmy Burke, who recognized a rare opportunity, a multi-million-dollar vault job with insider access and security flaws. He knew it could be history in the making. Jimmy didn't waste time. He sent one of his trusted men, Joe Budamanri, to meet with Louis and vet the operation. Joe wasn't there to shake hands. He intimidated Louis, made it clear that betrayal meant death, and took the blueprints, schedules, and security routines without a word of thanks. Louis, now neck-deep in mafia dealings, had no leverage. He had to hope they'd give him a cut, or at least let him live. Meanwhile, Peter, the original mastermind, was left in the dark. He thought the plan was still on ice, not knowing it had already reached the city's most dangerous hands. With the intel in place, Jimmy began assembling his dream team. He needed thieves, muscle, and people who could handle high-pressure jobs without folding. He chose 10 men total, some trusted killers, others experts in intimidation. Tommy DeSimone was of course at the center of it. Interestingly, Henry Hill wasn't included in the actual operation. Some say it was because of his growing addiction and involvement in drug trafficking which made him a liability. But Henry still knew something was up. Even though he wasn't part of the team, he could feel the energy shift in their circle. Back in Jimmy's world, the planning got meticulous. They studied guard rotations, alarm systems, door lock mechanics, and the ideal getaway routes. The heist was scheduled for December, the peak of cargo season, and the most chaotic time for warehouse logistics. That chaos was exactly what they needed to slip in unnoticed. The key to everything was the valuable room, a highly secured section of the Lufthansa building where cash and treasures were held. It was protected by 2 steel doors and 4 synchronized locks. Each door had to be opened with 2 keys at once, or a silent alarm would be triggered. The only man with those keys was the warehouse supervisor. Jimmy's crew couldn't just storm the place. They had to lure the supervisor away from his post without triggering suspicion or alarms. That's where Louis came in again. Since he worked inside, he would delay paperwork, stall the delivery company, and make sure the money stayed in the vault overnight. Everything hinged on timing. If Louis couldn't hold the shipment until after business hours on Friday, the armored trucks would arrive and the window would slam shut. On December 8, 1978, Louis pulled it off. He delayed the transfer so the cash would remain in the building over the weekend, unguarded and ripe for the taking. With that, Jimmy gave the green light. The heist would take place early Monday morning at the coldest and quietest hour of the night. They still needed a getaway van, large, dark, and untraceable. It took 2 days of searching before they finally stole a black van that wouldn't raise suspicion in the airport lot. Every team member was briefed down to the smallest detail. Their mission: enter the Lufthansa warehouse, subdue the workers, extract the cash, and vanish before sunrise. Jimmy rode separately with another crew member to provide backup in case of emergency. The rest of the crew piled into the van and waited for the clock to strike 3 a.m. They chose that time because it was the workers' meal break. No guards on patrol, no trucks coming in or out, just a skeleton crew upstairs. Perfect conditions for a silent invasion. The 6-man unit, led by Tommy, entered through the front of the warehouse. The remaining 2 members took the van around to the back gate, waiting for the signal to drive in. Inside, the workers were eating in the break room on the 3rd floor, oblivious to the storm about to hit. Suddenly, Tommy and his crew burst through the doors with guns drawn. Panic erupted and the workers froze in shock. Tommy's voice echoed through the room, calm but deadly. They demanded IDs and wallets to match names to a list Louis had provided. Each worker was identified and restrained, tied up on the floor with zip ties. Tommy reminded them that they now knew their names, addresses, and families. "Do as you're told," he warned, "and you walk out alive." Meanwhile, the 2 crew members in the van were still waiting by the back gate, growing nervous with every passing second. Something was wrong. They hadn't received the all-clear yet. Then the unexpected happened. A warehouse truck pulled up behind them. One of the missing workers was returning from a delivery. The worker, confused, approached the van thinking it was a shipment vehicle, but when he saw the men inside, maskless and armed, he bolted. The gunman chased him down and pistol-whipped him into compliance. He was thrown in the back of the van, gagged and tied like the others. A few moments later, the 7th and final worker stepped outside, having heard the noise. He was swiftly overpowered and thrown in with his colleague. Now, with all 7 workers secured, the crew could proceed. Joe Buddha came down to check and was relieved to find no one missing. They opened the loading gate and backed the van into the warehouse. Every second was now critical. Next, they had to deal with the warehouse supervisor, the only person who could open the vault. He was in his office, likely unaware of the chaos unfolding just feet away. Tommy grabbed one of the tied-up workers and forced him to place a call, pretending everything was normal. The worker was terrified but knew he had no choice. The call worked. The supervisor, thinking it was business as usual, agreed to come upstairs. The moment he stepped out of his office, he was greeted with a gun in his face. He froze, realizing instantly that something was terribly wrong. The supervisor was the only one who could trigger the silent alarm, but the crew knew that too. Tommy barked at him, "No funny business, we know the system." The supervisor, trembling, attempted to insert only one key, hoping to trigger the alarm discreetly. Tommy slammed him in the head with a pistol and growled, "Try that again and you're dead." Realizing the gang had insider knowledge, the supervisor gave in. He used both keys at once to unlock the outer door of the vault. They closed the door behind them, following protocol to avoid tripping any sensors. Then they opened the second door to the inner chamber and found the jackpot. Money, diamonds, jewelry, far more than anyone expected. They had braced for maybe 2 million, but the stacks told a different story. The team worked fast, loading everything into the van in less than 10 minutes. They moved like a machine, silent, coordinated, and deadly efficient. When the last box was packed, they gathered all the tied-up workers and tossed them back into the break room. They made sure the bindings were tight but not fatal. No one was killed that night, not because of mercy but because intimidation was more effective than blood. Dead witnesses attract headlines, scared ones keep quiet. The van pulled away just before 4 a.m. The crew met Jimmy at a rendezvous point nearby and confirmed that everything had gone exactly as planned. It was over. They had just pulled off the largest cash heist in American history, $6 million in untraceable money and high-end jewels. But as Jimmy stared at the boxes, he wasn't thinking about the money. He was thinking about how to keep it and who might need to disappear to protect it. As the black van vanished into the city's early morning fog, the crew could barely contain their excitement. Inside that vehicle was a fortune beyond any of their wildest expectations. They didn't just get lucky, they had struck gold, literally and figuratively. The final take wasn't $2 million as planned. It was a stunning $6 million in cash and jewelry. The money was clean, untraceable US currency collected from foreign exchanges. The jewelry was high-end, valuable enough to be fenced discreetly in black market networks. They transported the loot to a safe house owned by one of Jimmy's allies. The room buzzed with adrenaline as they opened box after box, stunned at their haul. The plan was to lay low for a while. No flashy purchases, no sudden spending, and absolutely no attention. Jimmy, being the operations mastermind, stressed this rule above all else. His warning was clear: act normal or you die normal. But that advice would soon fall on deaf ears. The very crew that pulled off the perfect heist began making stupid, fatal moves. The first red flag came when one of the thieves bought a brand new Cadillac. Not just any car, but a shiny pink one that screamed money. When Jimmy saw it, he exploded with rage. "What are you doing driving that thing around? Are you trying to get us all killed?" That was just the beginning. Another guy bought a fur coat for his wife that cost thousands and wore it to a mob party. FBI agents were already sniffing around JFK after the robbery hit the news. The moment they saw lavish spending, they smelled blood in the water. To the public, the robbery was a shock, but to investigators, it was clearly a mafia operation. No one else had the nerve or inside access. The police found the stolen van just days later, and the mistake that led to its discovery was infuriatingly careless. Edward Stacks, a minor associate, had been tasked with dumping the van. He was supposed to torch it, destroy evidence, and leave no trace. Instead, Stacks parked it illegally on a street corner and vanished. He spent the weekend doing drugs with his girlfriend, completely forgetting the plan. When cops found the van, it was a goldmine: documents, fingerprints, and links to the airport. That one error opened the floodgates for the FBI. Jimmy couldn't believe it. A perfect operation was now exposed because of one stoned amateur. Stacks had to go. Jimmy didn't wait. He ordered Tommy to handle it immediately. Tommy visited Stacks under the guise of a friendly drop-in, but as soon as Stacks turned his back, Tommy pulled the trigger and ended it. The body was left as a message: mistakes are not forgiven. The Mafia didn't believe in warnings, they believed in clean slates. With the feds now watching their every move, Jimmy's paranoia grew. He started suspecting not just outsiders, but his own men. To Jimmy, silence was security, but the more he looked around, the more he saw loose lips and loose spending. One by one, he started eliminating those he saw as liabilities: men who partied too hard, bragged too much, or looked too nervous. Even Joe Buddha Manry, who helped orchestrate the plan, wasn't spared. He and his wife were found shot dead in their car. The message was clear: Jimmy was cleaning house. No one was safe, not even close friends or longtime partners. At this point, Henry Hill, though not involved in the robbery, started to worry. He knew how Jimmy operated and feared being next on the hit list. Henry was already neck-deep in drug trafficking, despite being warned never to enter that world. Paul Vario, their mafia superior, had forbidden it completely. But Henry couldn't resist the profits. He built his own drug ring behind Vario's back, involving his wife and several friends. He grew paranoid, always checking the skies for helicopters. He was convinced the feds were watching, and this time he was right. In 1980, Henry's house was raided. Though he tried to flush the evidence, enough drugs were found to charge him. Worse yet, he was already on Vario's bad side. His secret dealings could now lead to execution, not just prison. Henry begged his wife to post bail. She scrambled to gather funds, but eventually turned to Jimmy for help. Jimmy paid the bail, but Henry sensed something was off. The warmth in Jimmy's voice was gone, replaced by rehearsed calm. Then came the request that sealed Henry's fate. Jimmy asked him to fly to Florida with another associate and take care of a problem. It was a hit job, but Henry knew the real target was him. He wasn't being sent to kill, he was being sent to die. Henry pretended to agree, but made other plans. He reached out to the FBI and offered to flip anything to survive. The Bureau didn't hesitate. Henry was Gold, a high-ranking associate with stories that could bring down the house. In exchange for his cooperation, Henry received full immunity. He and his family entered witness protection with new names and fresh identities. Once safe, he began confessing everything. From the Lufthansa heist to years of racketeering and violence, he held nothing back. His information led to the indictment of over 50 mob figures. Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke were among the most high-profile arrests. Paul was convicted on multiple charges and died in prison. Jimmy, too, was eventually locked away for life and died behind bars in 19... Tommy DeSimone didn't live long after the heist. Though he expected to be made into a full mafia member, he was set up and executed. The Gambino family ordered his death for a previous, unauthorized killing. His ambition had cost him his life. In the end, nearly everyone involved in the Lufthansa heist either vanished, was murdered, or went to prison. The riches came fast, but death came faster. The operation, once considered genius, unraveled because of greed, betrayal, and carelessness. It wasn't the law that destroyed them, it was their own behavior. The crew had managed to outsmart JFK Airport, security protocols, and even airport police, but they couldn't outsmart each other. As for Henry Hill, he became a media figure after the trial. He wrote books, gave interviews, and lived to tell the tale. His story inspired the film Goodfellas, which immortalized the characters and events. But even in safety, he remained haunted by the ghosts of his past. He died in 2012 at the age of 69. By then, most of the men he once called brothers were either dead or forgotten. What started as the most brilliant cash heist in US history became a cautionary tale. In the Mafia, the biggest threat isn't the cops, it's your own crew. And in a world built on silence, one voice telling the truth can shake the empire to its core. In the days after the robbery, chaos lingered in the shadows while the streets appeared calm. Inside law enforcement buildings, agents knew something huge had gone down, and they were determined to crack it. The crime wasn't just bold, it was surgical. It had the hallmarks of mafia involvement, and everyone in federal circles knew it wasn't the work of amateurs. Investigators immediately zeroed in on Lufthansa's cargo hub. The precision of the break-in suggested help from the inside. Surveillance footage was limited and security logs were vague, but the stolen van led to a breakthrough. The minute the plates were run, red flags went up. The van had been reported stolen just days before the robbery. Worse, it was found parked illegally, as if someone had forgotten to clean up the crime scene. Inside the vehicle, they discovered documents linking it to the warehouse. That one mistake shifted the investigation into overdrive. They ran fingerprints and examined the contents of the van. The match to Edward Stacks triggered internal alerts, linking him to a bar known for mafia traffic. Stacks wasn't a soldier. He was a small-time crook who had been pulled in for one job. Now he was the reason the feds had a solid direction. When agents showed up at his place, they found him already dead. Tommy had silenced him before he could say a word. Despite the loss of that lead, law enforcement doubled down. They knew they were close, and that fear was spreading within the crew. The FBI began tapping phones, following vehicles, and watching known hangouts. They weren't just hoping for confessions, they wanted to catch someone slipping. Meanwhile, tension among the robbers reached its peak. The ones who were still alive didn't trust anyone, including each other. Jimmy kept his distance, often hiding in safe houses or meeting only through intermediaries. He no longer trusted his own voice on the phone. One by one, anyone connected to the heist started disappearing. Not all were killed, but most went into hiding or ended up arrested. For Jimmy, paranoia became routine. If a guy talked too much or asked the wrong questions, he was marked for elimination. But while Jimmy was tying loose ends, the FBI was doing the opposite, untangling the mess piece by piece. They started with Louis Werner. Louis was already known to be a degenerate gambler. His financial trouble made him a prime suspect for helping orchestrate the crime. Investigators put pressure on him, visiting his workplace, knocking on his door late at night. He denied everything, but the pressure was suffocating. Eventually, Louis cracked. He didn't give them everyone, but he gave them enough. He named Joe Buddha as the link between him and the crew. Once the agents had that connection, they went back to Jimmy's known associates. By that time, Joe Buddha was already gone. Found shot alongside his wife, he was another body in the growing trail of corpses. Still, Louis's cooperation gave the feds insight into how the robbery had been planned. From warehouse access to alarm knowledge, it confirmed suspicions of an inside job. Federal prosecutors began building a RICO case targeting the entire crime network rather than just the individuals. They weren't after robbers, they were after an empire. Every tap, every tale, every whispered conversation became part of a larger puzzle. One slip by a crew member could bring the whole thing crashing down. The irony was that Jimmy's own caution was pushing things faster. His obsession with silence was leaving corpses and broken alliances behind. As informants emerged, the FBI started making quiet arrests. Some flipped for deals, others simply vanished, never to be seen again. Meanwhile, Jimmy kept track of who was dead and who might talk next. He didn't care how many lives it took, only that no one could trace anything back to him. But even Jimmy knew that the longer the case dragged on, the more dangerous it became. The FBI didn't give up on high-profile robberies. Public pressure was also rising. The press had caught wind of the $6 million heist and ran story after story, fanning public outrage. News anchors called it the crime of the decade. The public wanted answers and heads. Undercover agents were embedded in bars, trucking companies and restaurants linked to the mafia. They collected tips, rumors and code words used by insiders. Even Paul Vario, who operated several levels above the heist, came under scrutiny. The FBI knew about his influence and his silent nod of approval for airport jobs. Every financial transaction was now a red flag. Large cash purchases or flashy gifts were seen as signals. Wiretaps revealed snippets of coded conversations. They didn't mention Lufthansa by name, but they danced around it enough to build suspicion. In the background, Henry Hill continued moving drugs, breaking one of the mafia's sacred rules. Paul Vario had always made it clear, no drugs, no exceptions. Henry's behavior was reckless. He was sloppy, visibly strung out, and surrounded by addicts who had no loyalty to the code. The FBI finally raided Henry's home, seizing enough narcotics to charge him. The trap had been sprung, and Henry was stuck. For a man who once dreamed of mafia glory, he now faced the bleak reality of prison or something worse. He knew Vario wouldn't tolerate betrayal. That's when Henry decided he was done. He made the call that would blow the whole case open. He offered himself as a cooperating witness. What he gave the FBI was more than testimony. It was a guided tour through the mafia underworld. His intel connected dots the feds had only guessed at. From the planning stage to the getaway and the killings afterward, he gave them everything. He confirmed Jimmy's role as ringleader, Tommy's violence and Vario's blessing of the entire operation. Even details about minor crew members were logged. The FBI quickly entered him into witness protection, moving him across state lines and giving him a new identity. Henry had crossed the line and there was no going back. He testified in multiple trials, often under heavy guard. His presence in courtrooms was met with whispers, stares and death threats. Paul Vario was sentenced and died behind bars. Jimmy was hit with a life sentence after being convicted of a murder separate from the robbery. Tommy's fate was even darker. Thinking he was being promoted in the mafia, he was lured to a secret location and executed. The Gambino family had never forgotten that he killed one of their own without permission. His promotion had been a setup from the start. By the early 1980s, the crew behind the Lufthansa robbery had been dismantled. The dream that began in the cargo vault ended in silence, blood, and prison cells. The case remained open for years, with new information trickling in from interviews and books, but the main players were gone, and the money was never recovered. To this day, law enforcement believes much of the cash was laundered, buried, or spent through offshore accounts. The jewelry was likely sold piece by piece through underground channels. What stings the most for authorities is that despite their success in breaking the case, the loot vanished. The mafia had pulled off the perfect heist, but their downfall came from within. It wasn't technology or law enforcement skill that brought them down. It was pride, disobedience, and a crew that couldn't keep quiet. The Lufthansa case now serves as a case study in law schools and FBI training programs. It highlights how organized crime can outwit institutions until ego and greed get in the way. This story didn't end because the plan failed. It ended because the people failed. For those in Jimmy Burke's circle, silence was gold, but no one stayed silent. And in the end, that's what cost them everything. By the early 1980s, the mob was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was under a spotlight. The Lufthansa heist had grown from legend to liability, dragging its players into deep water. Each man who once celebrated the haul now feared his phone ringing at night. That sound often meant trouble, or worse, a final meeting with no return. Jimmy Burke, once the architect of the operation, had turned into its grim undertaker. He wasn't just covering tracks, he was erasing names permanently. He watched the walls close in and decided that eliminating risk meant eliminating people. The more bodies dropped, the quieter things stayed, or so he believed. Loyalty had been the gang's backbone. Now it was a relic of the past, buried beneath paranoia and power plays. Jimmy began operating like a ghost. No calls from home, no meetings without scouts, and no loyalty to anyone who wasn't useful. What had started as a tight brotherhood devolved into fear-fueled chaos. The men no longer trusted each other, they trusted their instincts. One by one, people involved in the aftermath began disappearing. Some were known associates, others were innocent messengers caught in the middle. The media noticed. Headlines called it the curse of the Lufthansa crew, highlighting the mysterious string of deaths tied to the robbery. And while Jimmy tightened his circle, he kept one eye on Henry Hill. Henry had become erratic. His behavior screamed liability. Jimmy was no fool. He knew Henry had started taking reckless chances, moving product through unstable dealers and even involving his wife. The drug operation had grown fast but without discipline. Henry's contacts weren't old-school mobsters. They were young, impulsive and dangerous. Vario, still behind bars, hadn't officially greenlit the drug trade. If word got back to him that Henry was pushing weight, he might retaliate from prison. Henry's situation worsened after a botched cocaine deal. A shipment was compromised and the people involved started flipping on one another. Fearing exposure, Jimmy gave Henry one last chance to prove himself. He asked him to travel to Florida, supposedly to settle a score with a man threatening the crew. Henry recognized the setup. He wasn't being sent to fix a problem, he was the problem. So instead of boarding a flight to Florida, he walked into an FBI office. His choice was simple: testify or vanish. The agents knew who he was before he said a word. They'd been hoping he'd show up and finally pull the thread that unraveled the entire network. Henry cut a deal: immunity in exchange for full cooperation. Everything he knew was now fair game for the prosecution. What he revealed was explosive. Names, dates, amounts, conversations. He recited it all like a diary that had never stopped recording. He confirmed that Jimmy had ordered multiple murders, including trusted friends. He explained how the money was moved, laundered, and split. The crew, once thought untouchable, began to fall like dominoes. Some surrendered, others fought. A few just disappeared. Jimmy was arrested soon after, first for a separate gambling charge, but the feds were building a far more dangerous case against him. They linked him to multiple murders through Henry's testimony and additional evidence. Eventually, he received a life sentence and never saw freedom again. The trial was a media sensation. Cameras followed every court appearance, and headlines praised Henry for his courage or scorned him as a traitor. Inside prison, Jimmy didn't last long. Cancer took him in 1996, a slow end to a once-feared figure. Tommy DeSimone had disappeared long before that. Believing he was finally getting his stripes, he walked into a setup orchestrated by another mafia family. His crime: killing a made man without permission years earlier. That act signed his death certificate. They didn't hesitate. Tommy was shot and buried without ceremony, an unceremonious end for someone known for unpredictable violence. Of all the men who played a role in the heist, only a few survived the fallout. Some faded into obscurity, others landed in protective custody like Henry. The money, on the other hand, was never found. Not a dollar, not a diamond, not one traceable item ever turned up. Experts believe the cash was quickly broken down into smaller parcels, then funneled through offshore accounts, jewelry exchanges or overseas dealers. It vanished with the crew. The Lufthansa robbery became more than just a crime story. It became folklore, mob legends, betrayals, and headlines that never faded from memory. Hollywood caught wind of the story. Filmmakers were drawn to its mix of loyalty, crime, and the thin line between ambition and destruction. The 1990 film Goodfellas was a direct result of Henry's confessions. It portrayed his life from teenage errands to the collapse of his world. The movie turned Henry into a cultural icon, though he never found peace. Even in witness protection, his past followed him like a shadow. He bounced from city to city, unable to settle. Addiction, regret, and paranoia shaped the rest of his life. Despite the fame, he remained haunted. He had betrayed everyone: his friends, his wife, even his own code. By the time he passed in 2012, he had long become a relic of a bygone world. The Mafia no longer operated the same way, and Henry had outlived the era he once glorified. The FBI considered the case a major success. It showcased how informants could dismantle powerful criminal networks when used strategically. But in the streets, the lesson was different. Trust, once broken, can't be fixed. Not in the underworld. The Lufthansa heist was textbook perfect, but the crew, a tragic study in ego, excess, and collapse. It began with inside knowledge and surgical timing. It ended with fear, funerals, and betrayal. Every rule that made the Mafia strong was violated after the score. Greed outpaced loyalty and silence turned to panic. This was no Hollywood script. It was reality, more twisted than fiction could ever dream. What should have been a flawless victory became a self-inflicted disaster. Even now, decades later, the story sends chills through those who study organized crime. Not just because of what they stole, but what they lost. The money was real, the danger was real, but so was the fallout, and in the end, only ghosts remain. The dust had barely settled after the heist, but inside the Mafia world, the pressure was already building. Loyalty was expected, yet suspicion had become the air they breathed. Jimmy Burke, once hailed as the mastermind of the biggest cash robbery in America, was now the silent executioner. He had no time for weakness and no patience for risk. Every day brought a new threat, a rumor, a question, a federal agent loitering near someone's cousin's bar. Jimmy saw these signs and acted fast, like a man who knew time was against him. After eliminating Stax Edwards for mishandling the getaway van, Jimmy's instincts kicked into overdrive. He believed that mistakes could only be corrected with finality. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shout. He simply gave an order, and when Jimmy gave an order, men disappeared. That's what happened to Joe Buddha Manry and his wife. They were found slumped over in their car, each with a bullet to the head. No witnesses, no second chances, just the mafia's brutal version of quality control. And Jimmy wasn't done. As the weeks passed, he became more ruthless, cleaning up anything that resembled a loose thread. He warned his crew repeatedly, don't spend the money, don't flash, don't slip. But his men couldn't resist temptation, and that made them targets. Angelo Sepe had bought a luxury car and was seen wearing expensive clothes. Jimmy saw him flaunt his wealth, and it was all the reason he needed. Angelo's body turned up days later in an abandoned car riddled with bullets. The message was loud and cold: anyone who brings heat gets iced. The same fate awaited Marty Krugman, the bookmaker who originally connected Louis Werner to Jimmy's crew. Krugman had become paranoid, fearing he'd be cut out of his share. He started talking too much, asking too many questions, calling too many people. Jimmy knew Marty's fear could lead him straight to the feds. Soon, Krugman vanished without a trace. Another man in Jimmy's circle, another ghost added to the list. Jimmy's strategy was working for a while. The fewer mouths there were, the less likely someone would talk. But while bodies were being buried, the FBI was quietly gathering data. Henry Hill had not yet flipped, but the walls were closing in on him too. By this point, Henry was juggling paranoia, drug trafficking, and family problems. His relationship with Karen, his wife, was falling apart. Karen, once the loyal mafia wife, had grown tired of the stress and secrecy. The glamour had faded, replaced by fear and suspicion. They both used cocaine regularly, clouding their judgment and increasing their volatility. Henry's business decisions became erratic, his phone calls careless. One night he spotted a helicopter hovering above his house and assumed it was the FBI. He wasn't wrong. The Bureau had been watching him for months. They knew about his drug ring, his contacts in Pittsburgh, and the deals made behind Vario's back. Henry's operations had crossed a line. He wasn't just moving product, he was working without authorization in a world where nothing happened without permission. Paul Vario, still influential even behind bars, had warned his crew to stay out of the narcotics business, but Henry did it anyway, believing the cash justified the risk. When the FBI finally raided his house, the agents found small but incriminating amounts of cocaine. It wasn't a major bust, but it was enough. Henry knew the truth. If Vario found out, he'd be dead before the trial even started. Jail wasn't the threat. Jimmy and the mafia were. Desperate, Karen reached out to Jimmy, begging him for bail money. Jimmy agreed, but Henry immediately sensed the trap. When Jimmy suggested a trip to Florida to handle a guy causing problems, Henry saw it for what it was, a death sentence. He wasn't meant to return. He played along, pretending to go along with the plan. But after that meeting, he went straight to the FBI. When he walked into that office, he carried the fate of everyone around him. His testimony would become one of the most devastating betrayals in mafia history. The FBI saw him as the ultimate prize, a gateway to not just the Lufthansa heist, but decades of organized crime activity. Henry knew everything. He didn't hold back. From the planning stages of the robbery to the murders that followed, he spelled it all out with terrifying clarity. Names, dates, weapons, payouts. Henry gave the government everything. In return, they gave him and his family new names, new homes, and a fresh start. As his information was compiled, the mafia world trembled. For decades, these men had ruled with fear. Now fear was coming for them. Henry testified in courtrooms, often under heavy protection. His words sent shockwaves across New York. The government finally had the leverage they needed to bring down Paul Vario, Jimmy Burke, and a host of other powerful men. The unbreakable code of silence had been shattered. Jimmy was arrested and eventually convicted, not just for his involvement in illegal gambling, but later for murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Inside, Jimmy never adapted. He remained defiant, angry, and silent until the end. Cancer took him in 1996, a slow and painful demise for a man who once orchestrated brilliance through fear. He died as prisoner 7/12/6054. Tommy DeSimone's fate was no less grim. Believing he was being made into a full-fledged mafia member, Tommy had been lured to what he thought was a promotion ceremony. Instead, he was ambushed and executed, most likely by members of the Gambino family. His fatal mistake, killing a made man years earlier without permission. His body was never found, but word of his death spread quickly. It was mafia justice, served cold and without apology. Meanwhile, Vincent Asaro, one of the lesser-known figures in the heist, managed to avoid prosecution for decades. He kept a low profile and survived the bloodbath that claimed so many others. Incredibly, he wasn't arrested in connection with the robbery until 2014, 36 years after the fact. Even then, he was acquitted at trial. His cousin Gary Valenti was less fortunate. He turned on Vincent and testified against him in court, igniting headlines all over again. Despite the late arrest and high-profile trial, Asaro served time on separate charges. He died in 2023 at age 88, one of the few still standing after the storm. Back in witness protection, Henry Hill tried to rebuild, but peace didn't come easily. He missed the adrenaline, the money, the twisted brotherhood, so he began revealing more about his past, writing books, appearing in interviews, and even consulting on Goodfellas. The film immortalized his story. Millions watched as his life unraveled on screen, charmed by the mafia, destroyed by betrayal. The movie didn't just entertain, it educated an entire generation on the power and peril of organized crime. Henry became both celebrity and cautionary tale. But fame couldn't erase his demons. Addiction, failed relationships, and trauma followed him wherever he went. He moved several times, always looking over his shoulder. Though the threat of mafia retaliation diminished over the years, it never fully disappeared. In 1990, he divorced Karan after 23 years of marriage. The bond that once tied them together had eroded under the weight of everything they'd endured. Despite his cooperation with the government, Henry continued struggling with the very habits that once brought him down. Cocaine remained a constant. He lived the rest of his life jumping between interviews, small business ventures, and private battles. And in 2012, he died at age 69, heart failure caused by a lifetime of excess. By then, most of the people involved in the Lufthansa heist were either dead or imprisoned. The crew that once executed a $6 million theft had scattered into history. Yet the heist still stands as a legend, not just for how it was pulled off, but for how it fell apart. No armored trucks were ambushed, no dramatic shootouts. It was silence, missteps, and betrayal that undid it all. If everyone had simply followed the plan, no flash, no noise, no greed, they might have gotten away with it. But that's not how the underworld works. The mafia is a world of rules. Break them and you're erased. And once Henry broke the final rule, never rat, it all came crashing down. Today, law enforcement schools study the case as a masterclass in how criminal empires crumble, and aspiring criminals look at it as a warning. Even perfect crimes come with consequences. The money, gone. The trust, broken. The people, mostly dead. But the story lives on, passed from one generation to the next. A tale of brilliance ruined by betrayal, a reminder that no score is ever clean. In the months following the Lufthansa robbery, the underworld in New York felt different. The usual rhythm of mafia life had shifted. Now it pulsed with suspicion, silence, and fear. Everyone still alive from the crew knew the air was toxic. Friends avoided each other, and phone calls became shorter, vaguer, colder. Where once there had been toasts and laughter, now there were whispered warnings. Lay low, they said, though no one could explain what that even meant anymore. Trust, the currency that had always fueled the mafia, had vanished overnight. Loyalty didn't mean much when everyone expected a bullet around the corner. Jimmy Burke, who once acted with surgical precision, began unraveling in real time. He was consumed by one emotion: fear that someone would flip. He didn't sleep soundly, he didn't eat normally, he paced floors, stared out windows, and counted the faces still alive. Every time someone made a purchase, he took it as a betrayal. Every time someone got chatty at a bar, he considered them marked. And those marks, they didn't last long. Each week brought a new disappearance or body discovered in a vacant lot. The media tried to keep up with the body count, but it was impossible. Even seasoned detectives admitted they'd never seen a crew implode this fast. For the FBI, the pile of corpses only validated their theory. The mafia didn't just clean up after mistakes, they exterminated potential threats, and that included their own. They set up surveillance near known mafia hotspots, pizzerias, clubs, auto shops, and union offices. They listened for any whisper of the heist. But what they found instead was silence. No one mentioned Lufthansa. No one even breathed the name. That's what made them certain. Jimmy was behind it. Only a man that dangerous could keep so many mouths shut through force alone. Meanwhile, inside the Lucchese family there was tension too. Paul Vario had backed Jimmy in many ventures, but this one was too loud. The heat was spreading, and the family didn't want federal attention. In their world, cash was great, but only if it didn't come with subpoenas. Paul, already behind bars, had to watch as the empire he helped build began to wobble. His orders still held weight, but less than before. He kept hearing rumors. Jimmy was reckless, Henry was using, and Tommy had crossed lines that couldn't be ignored. Control was slipping. One rumor particularly disturbed Paul. It was about Karen Hill, Henry's wife, and an uncomfortable incident involving Tommy DeSimone. The details were murky, but the story went that Tommy had made aggressive moves toward Karen while Henry was serving time. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a violation of family lines. What made it worse? Karen wasn't just Henry's wife. She was also romantically involved with Paul while her husband was away. That secret added fuel to the fire. If the story got out, Paul's leadership would be questioned. He had to act without revealing his own weakness. So when the Gambino family came forward requesting justice for the murder of one of their made men, William Benfina, it gave Paul a way out. Tommy had killed Benfina years before. The hit was unauthorized, and in mafia law that made Tommy expendable. Paul agreed to the request, quietly, discreetly, no public fuss, just a message sent through the ranks. Tommy was told he was getting made. It was the honor he'd waited his whole life for, the moment where a street soldier became untouchable. He dressed for the occasion. He was calm, proud, and ready, but he had no idea he was being led to an execution. Two Lucchese associates picked him up. One of them was Peter Vario, Paul's own son. They drove him to a quiet house under the guise of celebration. Once inside, Tommy was shot in the face without a word. It wasn't personal, it was business, mafia justice, swift and cold. When Jimmy learned of Tommy's death, he was devastated. Tommy had been more than a partner, he'd been like family. But Jimmy also understood the rules. Tommy had killed someone he shouldn't have, and in their world, there were no second chances. Still, it lit a fire in Jimmy. He doubled down on secrecy. From that moment on, he trusted no one, not even his own reflection. Meanwhile, Henry Hill was sinking deeper into chaos. His drug business had ballooned, and with it came new contacts, none of whom were trustworthy. He was working deals with amateurs, guys who couldn't keep quiet and didn't understand the consequences of betrayal. The money was flowing fast, but so were the risks. Henry was doing coke, making poor decisions, and alienating everyone close to him. Karen saw it. She watched the man she married dissolve into someone she no longer recognized. Even their kids felt the tension. The home was thick with paranoia, screaming matches, and late-night knocks on the door. Henry started believing every sound outside was the police, or worse, a hit squad. He stopped sleeping. He stopped thinking clearly. It all came to a head when the FBI finally raided his house. They had been watching him for weeks, collecting enough to make a solid arrest. Karen tried to flush the drugs, but some remained. It was enough for charges, enough to change everything. Sitting in a cell, Henry knew what was coming. Vario would hear, Jimmy would hear, and they wouldn't forgive him for dragging heat back to their doorstep. He had a choice, prison or protection, and he chose the latter. He met with the feds, not just to talk, but to unleash a flood. What he gave them changed the course of organized crime in New York. He didn't just name names. He mapped out operations, explained codes, and recounted details no one else could have known. Prosecutors called his testimony gold. Defense attorneys called it betrayal, but it worked. Dozens of indictments followed. Big names fell. Hidden operations were exposed. Jimmy was charged first with racketeering, then with murder. His time on the outside was officially over. He entered prison a legend but left it in a coffin. Cancer claimed him after years of appeals and isolation. Paul Vario didn't fare much better. His own conviction was tied to Henry's statements. He died behind bars, bitter and broken. By the early 1990s, the Lucchese family had lost many of its strongest voices. What remained was a hollowed-out shell. The Lufthansa Heist, which had once been a moment of triumph, was now a curse. Anyone tied to it either died, disappeared, or became an informant. Even among the five families, the job became taboo. It was spoken of rarely and always with caution. It had been too perfect, too successful, and too destructive. Henry, now in witness protection, tried to rebuild, but the world outside the mafia didn't understand him. He couldn't relate to neighbors, couldn't trust colleagues. He was always looking over his shoulder. Despite government promises, protection felt like exile. He had money but no freedom, safety but no peace. He bounced between cities, changed names, altered his appearance. Still, the past followed him like a shadow. Eventually, he began talking, first in interviews, then in books. He wanted to control the story, to reclaim the narrative. His efforts reached Hollywood. Director Martin Scorsese turned his life into the film Goodfellas, casting Ray Liotta to play Henry. The film stunned audiences. It was raw, unforgiving, and brutally honest. It showed the glamour but also the rot. The fast cars and sharp suits couldn't cover the stench of betrayal. Henry was thrust into the spotlight again. Interviews, documentaries, speaking tours. But he wasn't a hero. He was a warning, a man who had seen everything and lost almost all of it. Even in his final years, addiction remained. He drank heavily, he used, he lived recklessly. In 2012, he died from heart complications. The mafia never got to him, but life did. As the years passed, the Lufthansa heist remained legend, not for the money stolen, but for the lives lost afterward. It was a blueprint in brilliance, ruined by greed, a perfect plan executed by imperfect men. The money never surfaced. Some say it's buried in Long Island. Others claim it left the country the same week it was taken. But no one really cares about the money anymore. What matters is the lesson. In the world of organized crime, the smartest men don't just plan the job, they survive the aftermath. Jimmy Burke was brilliant, but he trusted too many unstable people. Tommy DeSimone was loyal but too violent, too loud, too unpredictable. He broke a sacred rule and paid the ultimate price. Henry Hill was insightful but weak. He cracked under pressure, betrayed his brothers and couldn't escape the weight of his choices. And in the end, the mafia itself took a hit. The trial, the headlines and the betrayals made the public feel like anything was possible, even beating the mob. Law enforcement gained confidence. They understood now every empire has cracks. You just have to know where to look and when to push. Long after the last bullet was fired and the courtrooms emptied, one question lingered. Where did the money from the Lufthansa heist actually go? It wasn't just a few bags of bills, it was over $6 million in cash and jewels. Adjusted for inflation, it would be more than $25 million today. Authorities had traced the crime, captured testimonies and convicted major players, but not a single dollar from the haul was ever recovered. The vault had been emptied with surgical precision, yet it seemed as if the money had been swallowed by the earth. Jimmy Burke was the man who controlled the cash after the heist. It was his operation and everyone knew he held the keys to the treasure. But Jimmy was no fool. He wasn't going to leave that kind of wealth lying around. From the very beginning, he distributed it carefully using code and intermediaries. He funneled small amounts through pawn shops, nightclubs and betting operations. A portion was sent overseas, Switzerland, the Bahamas, possibly even Ireland. Offshore banking made it easy to disappear money in a matter of hours. Some of the cash went into real estate, quiet purchases in the names of girlfriends and cousins. No paper trail, just new deeds and paid taxes. The jewelry was even easier to vanish. Fencing stolen diamonds and watches took only a few contacts, especially in New York's underground market. Within weeks, millions were broken down, laundered and reintroduced into the system. The government had nothing but theories and rumors. Jimmy never admitted where he stashed the bulk of it. He took that secret with him when he died in 19... But speculation never stopped. Some believe he buried parts of the loot in Long Island or the Catskills following old mob tradition. Others say he kept it in cash, spread across safety deposit boxes registered under fake names. Several were allegedly located in Miami and Chicago. There were even whispers about a hidden vault beneath a Queen's bar he once controlled. But if it existed, no one ever found it. Henry Hill gave the FBI plenty of details about the people and the plan, but when it came to the money, even he couldn't help much. He claimed that by the time the arrests began, most of the money had already changed hands. Whatever remained was either buried or burned. He believed Jimmy had started hoarding the cash, refusing to pay out full shares. That greed, he said, is what drove the killings. Everyone expected a cut, but Jimmy saw the money as leverage. Pay too much and people start talking. Pay too little and they disappear. That strategy kept him powerful, but also made him a target. Many of the crew started resenting him, suspecting he'd stolen from his own men. The paranoia that followed wasn't just about getting caught, it was about not getting paid, and in that world, nothing provokes violence faster than missing money. Even today, former detectives shake their heads when asked about the missing loot. They'll tell you the plan was tight, but the escape was airtight. There were no bank transfers to trace, no sudden luxury purchases by Jimmy himself. The money was moved with discipline. After the heist, several of Jimmy's close associates began making low-key investments, nightclubs, car services, and even vending machine businesses. They were fronts. The money cleaned itself slowly, slipping into legitimacy under the radar. Authorities suspected these businesses were funded by Lufthansa cash, but suspicion isn't evidence. Every time the FBI closed in on one of the fronts, it had already changed ownership. They were always one step behind. Some believe the mafia's hierarchy absorbed much of the take. The Lucchese family, through Paul Vario, likely received a large silent tribute. It was their turf, after all. Nothing that big happened without their blessing. That portion may have been split among capos and underbosses, converted to silent shares in businesses or overseas investments. It's likely much of the treasure lies in places beyond reach, in retirement homes, anonymous trusts, or simply cash still hidden in walls. If any of the original crew had family members who inherited the funds, they've kept silent. No one has come forward to claim a dime. Those who dared to ask questions during the aftermath met grim ends. Marty Krugman tried to demand his share and vanished. Louis Werner, the airport insider, thought he could claim a portion later, but his credibility collapsed and so did his freedom. Even the higher-ups who knew about the score kept quiet. Speaking of that money, even decades later, still felt like inviting death. The cultural silence became part of the legend. Ask about Lufthansa and you'll end up in the Hudson, the saying went. It's ironic, the most well-documented robbery in American history remains unsolved in the one way that truly mattered. The cash trail went ice cold. Law enforcement teams tried to reopen the financial angle years later. They followed old records, traced real estate deeds and monitored bank activity. They hoped some relative would make a mistake, a big deposit, a suspicious purchase, but no one did. Jimmy's discipline had worked. The money had slipped through the cracks of a city built to hide it. Private investigators joined the hunt in the 90s and early 2000s. Some claimed to be close, but none produced proof. Documentaries hinted at discoveries, old properties linked to the crew, sealed basements, dry wells, unexplored crawl spaces. But every time the story ended in mystery. No diamonds, no cash, just dust and shadows. In the digital age, some hoped that blockchain technology might eventually reveal accounts connected to the heist, but those dreams remained distant. What made the Lufthansa robbery so devastating wasn't just its scale, it was how thoroughly it vanished. Even Hollywood couldn't imagine a better ending. The crime succeeded, the crew imploded, the money disappeared like smoke. Years later, Henry Hill would still get asked about it. Did Jimmy really keep it all, they'd whisper. Henry always shrugged. If he did, he didn't spend it. That's what made it genius and tragic. Some believe Jimmy hid parts of the loot for his children. Others think he spent most of it on bribes, payoffs and silence. Money in the mafia isn't just spent, it's exchanged for loyalty, and when trust dies, money becomes your last weapon. That's how Jimmy survived as long as he did. He used the money like a shield, always with the threat of a reward or punishment. It kept people scared, it kept the cops guessing, it kept the FBI frustrated for years. To this day, no official amount has ever been recovered. Lufthansa itself never disclosed the full inventory stolen that night. Some insiders say it was more than $6 million, possibly closer to $8 or $9 million, but the company went quiet fast. Their insurance paid out and the silence began. Internally, they feared more heists if details got out. That silence helped the robbers. Less information meant fewer leads, fewer trails to follow. It allowed Jimmy to move freely in the months that followed, laundering and liquidating piece by piece. To this day, urban legends circle JFK Airport. Stories of gold bars hidden in walls, bags buried near hangars, and janitors who heard whispers they never dared repeat. It's said a security guard once found a bundle of cash under a cargo pallet years later, but he never reported it, he just kept walking. Old-timers at bars near Ozone Park tell tales of the last big score. They sip whiskey, laugh quietly, and never name names. Everyone knows what happened, but no one says it out loud. That silence, oddly enough, is louder than any confession. As of now, the Lufthansa cash remains America's most infamous missing fortune, a treasure taken in the blink of an eye and dissolved into history. Somewhere out there, maybe buried in concrete or lost in numbers, lies the last piece of that epic puzzle, but no one will talk. And those who knew where to look, they're all dead, or pretending they never existed. Long after the final arrests and fading funeral processions, the Lufthansa heist refused to vanish. Its story, equal parts crime and legend, was simply too cinematic to forget. The crime scene became folklore in New York's boroughs. Cab drivers told versions of it to tourists. Retired cops argued over coffee about who really planned it. Neighborhood kids who once saw gangsters in silk suits now pointed to boarded-up bars and said, "That's where it all started." Streets became storybooks. And then came the movies. Hollywood, always hungry for dark brilliance, saw gold in the wreckage. Producers, writers, and studio execs began circling. The underworld hadn't just fallen, it had set the stage. Journalists were the first to crack it open. In the 1980s, Nicholas Pileggi wrote Wise Guy, a non-fiction masterpiece based on Henry Hill's life. It wasn't just another mob story. It was raw, unfiltered, and devastatingly personal. Readers weren't just witnessing crimes, they were sitting in the getaway car. Pileggi's writing gave the Mafia a new kind of exposure. No longer just headlines, now it had a human voice. That voice belonged to Henry Hill, the man who brought down the very life he once glorified. He didn't flinch from the truth, he embraced it. He described the drug runs, the paranoia, the lies, and the fear of knowing that every friend might become your killer. It was chilling and addictive. The book's success caught Hollywood's eye, and then Martin Scorsese stepped in. By the late 80s, Scorsese had a reputation for gritty, visceral storytelling. He didn't want a movie about heroes, he wanted the truth. He partnered with Pileggi and began adapting Wise Guy into what would become one of the most iconic gangster films of all time, Goodfellas. Released in 1990, the movie wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural earthquake. It shattered the romanticism of mob life and replaced it with claustrophobia and chaos. Ray Liotta played Henry Hill with haunted charm. He wasn't a villain or a hero, he was just a man who couldn't stop chasing adrenaline. Robert De Niro portrayed Jimmy Conway, a fictionalized version of Jimmy Burke. He was charismatic, meticulous, and terrifying all at once. And Joe Pesci, in an Oscar-winning performance, brought Tommy DeVito to life, volatile, violent, and unforgettable. Audiences sat in silence during certain scenes, brutal killings, sudden betrayals, and moments of unbearable tension. This wasn't The Godfather, this was reality, stripped of myth. One scene in particular, Tommy's execution, left a permanent mark. Viewers realized, maybe for the first time, that in the mob, even the boldest die quietly. The film's pacing mirrored the rise and fall of the Lufthansa Heist. Fast, flashy, then falling apart, like a car going 100 with no brakes. Scorsese didn't glamorize, he exposed, and in doing so he made history. Goodfellas was nominated for 6 Academy Awards and won Best Supporting Actor for Pesci, but more importantly, it entered American pop culture forever. It redefined how organized crime was portrayed. No more loyalty fantasies, just greed, ego, and fear. Suddenly, Henry Hill was everywhere. He appeared on talk shows, crime specials, and magazine covers. People wanted to know everything: where the money went, how close he came to death, whether he missed that world. Henry never fully left the spotlight. He became both a consultant and a cautionary tale. He participated in documentaries, helped with crime shows, and even did cooking segments. Strange but true. He lived with a fractured identity, protected by law but hunted by memory. Even in witness protection, he had to keep moving. The mob might have changed, but vengeance never sleeps. Years later, interviews with his children revealed the cost. Growing up in hiding, changing names, never knowing who might come knocking. One of his daughters said she kept a weapon near the door until she was a teenager. That was life after the Mafia. Henry once admitted he missed the rush, the cash, the control, the feeling of being feared. But he also said he wouldn't wish it on anyone. You lose everyone, he once said, even yourself. As for the other survivors, there were very few. Most died in prison, in exile, or in silence. Their names, once feared in city alleys, now live on through fictional echoes and film credits. Jimmy Burke, never honored, never forgotten. Just a man whose genius died behind bars. Tommy DeSimone, still a ghost. His remains never found. His legend never quite faded. Paul Vario, once a boss, now a footnote. Even power ends in prison sheets. Vincent Asaro, one of the last names loosely connected to the heist, managed to evade the consequences for decades. His trial in 2015 stirred the past once again. But even then, jurors found him not guilty, not because he was innocent, because the evidence had aged and faded like everything else. By then, the myth had already taken over. Facts didn't matter as much as memory. The Lufthansa heist wasn't just a robbery, it became a symbol, a time capsule of ambition, betrayal, and a world crumbling from within. Crime historians still rank it among the greatest heists in US history, not just for the money stolen, but for the fallout it caused. Unlike other robberies, this one left behind no winners, only survivors. And as Hollywood kept retelling the story, new generations became fascinated by it. College students studied it, film students recreated scenes. Even FBI agents use it in training, learning how fear works, how codes break, and how betrayal spreads like fire. Some mob movies came after Goodfellas, trying to recapture that energy. Few succeeded. The reason? Goodfellas was rooted in truth, real people, real blood, real downfall. It didn't invent drama, it simply repeated it frame by frame. Years later, Scorsese admitted he wasn't trying to glorify anything. It's not about crime, he said, it's about the cost of crime. And that cost is eternal. The money's gone, the players are gone, but the story won't die. Tourists still visit the JFK cargo area. They ask employees, was this the place? The workers just smile and nod. Some locations featured in the movie have become landmarks. Restaurants, bars, alleyways, each carrying a whisper from the past. Fans reenact the scenes. Couples quote lines over dinner. Comedians mimic the accents. But behind the pop culture lies a darker truth. Real people died. Families were destroyed. Entire neighborhoods changed. And yet the fascination grows. Why? Because the Lufthansa heist wasn't just a crime, it was a mirror. It showed us how greed corrodes trust, how power isolates, how brilliance without boundaries eats itself alive. It made audiences ask uncomfortable questions. What would I have done? Would I have taken the money, stayed silent? That's why it endures. It isn't just history, it's human. The heist gave birth to legends, but legends don't live forever. They fade, they shift, they leave behind echoes and questions that never stop ringing. More than 4 decades after the crime, the Lufthansa heist still holds its place in American criminal history. Not because it was flawless, but because it revealed how perfection always cracks. The robbery was a masterpiece of planning, but the fallout proved no plan survives the people executing it. Everyone had a role, everyone had a motive, and everyone had limits. Once those limits were tested, the empire built in silence collapsed in screams. The money was gone within days, but the real explosion took years to echo through New York's underworld. The heist marked a turning point in mafia operations. It exposed how greed, ego, and mistrust could kill a crew faster than bullets. Old codes of honor were replaced by backdoor deals, and the age of informants began. From Henry Hill's confessions to courtroom testimonies, the entire mafia playbook was thrown into the public eye. No secrets stayed sacred. The 5 families, once seemingly untouchable, suddenly looked vulnerable. They still held power, but the mystique had vanished. Federal agencies took notice. The success of witness protection, RICO laws, and undercover operations increased tenfold after this case. Law enforcement learned how the mafia truly worked. Not just the crimes, but the culture, the rituals, the silent rules. For mobsters, the lessons were even darker. No matter how much you steal, you can't buy back trust. Jimmy Burke taught them that paranoia can feel like protection, but it's also poison. It turns friends into suspects and silence into screams. Tommy DeSimone reminded them that violence has limits. Cross the wrong line even if you're loyal, and the mafia will write you off. Henry Hill became a ghost in plain sight, a man who betrayed his code, lost his world, and lived in the shadows of a life he once ruled. And yet he's also the reason the world knows the story. Without his words, the Lufthansa heist might have stayed a mystery. Instead, it became a mirror, reflecting not just crime but the frailty of power. To this day, no one has ever found the missing millions. The vault was emptied in hours, but the truth was buried for decades. It's believed that what wasn't laundered was buried, burned, or split among silent investors, and the few who knew the exact figures took those numbers to the grave. Even now, crime analysts revisit the case, hoping to uncover one last detail, but it always ends the same way: dead ends, vanished clues, empty vaults. And in a strange way, that's what makes the Lufthansa heist unforgettable. Not what it gave, but what it cost. It cost trust, blood, freedom, and for many, life itself. No one got away clean, not even the ones who disappeared. The heist wasn't just a crime, it was a prophecy. It showed what happens when rules are bent too far for too long. From the back halls of JFK Airport to the glimmer of Vegas lights, the mafia learned the lesson hard. Flash gets you killed, silence doesn't save you, and sometimes success is the deadliest trap of all. Today, newer criminals look at the Lufthansa job as a myth to chase or a curse to avoid. It's the tale they whisper in prison yards, the one they replay in film school lectures, the one that keeps investigators digging. Because somewhere, in some forgotten corner of America, the truth might still be hiding. In a basement, a safety box, a name scribbled on an old envelope. Or maybe, just maybe, it's all gone, swallowed by the very silence that once protected it. The Lufthansa heist is no longer just a headline, it's a symbol of how fast you can rise and how much faster you can fall. And that is what makes it America's most genius and most haunted airport heist.